Thank you, Daron, for inviting me here today. Some of you may know me from ABC's Catalyst program. I was investigative journalist for ABC for about 10 years until the unfortunate demise of the program about a year and a half ago when ABC decided to axe the program and the entire team was made redundant. I'm a former scientist. I did a PhD in rheumatology. I now work as a consultant for the Nordic Cochrane collaboration, which is essentially a big consortium of scientists who do health and medical research projects and distinctly function with no industry funding. I'm here today to talk about Statin Wars. It's a paper, a peer-reviewed narrative review that was published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine in January this year. It's called Statin Wars, Have We Been Misled by the Evidence? So there's the reference if you want some more detail on my talk today. So a bit of background on statins. They're the most widely prescribed cholesterol-lowering drug on the planet. So they're an incredibly lucrative drug class, with Pfizer's Lipitor being the most profitable drug in the history of medicine. Since their introduction, their 20-year patents have expired, but despite the expiration of these patents, the total sales is expected to reach $1 trillion by 2020. So there's no doubt that the statin empire is big business. Now, there's been an exponential rise in the prescribing of statins. In the early days, we were only prescribing statins to people at high risk of heart disease. So these are people who've already had a heart attack or stroke with diagnosed disease. Then an influential group began recommending or promoting that statins be prescribed to everybody over the age of 50, even if you had normal cholesterol levels. A few years ago, we had some pediatricians saying that we should start screening kids for high cholesterol, and Pfizer ended up marketing some grape-flavoured statins to children and adolescents as potential recipients of these medications. We had a very high-profile cardiologist in the UK who published in the American Journal of Cardiology suggesting that statins were so safe and so effective that we should offer them as condiments in burger outlets to counter the effects of a fast food meal. I've even interviewed people who've participated in debates in the US about putting statins in the water supply. So this exponential rise in the prescribing of statins has caused a very large chasm between two parts of the medical profession. The proponents say that statins are incredibly life-saving, that they're one of the most important advances in medical history and have prevented untold heart attacks and strokes. But the other side of the spectrum has become more skeptical, and they say that statins are largely unnecessary and serve no purpose in lowering cholesterol to prevent cardiac problems. So who's right, and why is it that we've got this bitter divide amongst a group of educated doctors who are all looking at the same literature? Well, my proposition today is that we need to follow the money. And that's usually a proposition when you're dealing with industries of this size. The cost of developing a drug, a prescription drug, to gain market attention nowadays exceeds $2.5 billion. So instead of developing a new drug, drug companies understand that an effective way to fast-track company profits is to extend the indications of an existing drug that they already have. And that's essentially what happened with statins. In the early 2000s, the US National Cholesterol and Education Program simply revised their definition of high cholesterol. So it used to be at about 6 or 6.5, and then they lowered it gradually to 5.5. I think now it's below 5. And so by simply just lowering the threshold of what we call high cholesterol, millions more people became eligible for these medications overnight. So it wasn't based on any new science at all. It was just on this prevailing view that when it comes to cholesterol, the lower, the better. Skepticism arose when it was discovered that 8 out of 9 of those people deciding to lower that threshold actually had direct financial ties to statin manufacturers. In 2013, the American College of Cardiologists and the American Heart Association decided that they were going to move away from looking at just a single number of high cholesterol, and they decided to look at a patient's overall cardiac risk. So if you go to a doctor nowadays, they'll usually assess the risk of developing heart disease over a period of time. So these calculators take into account not only your cholesterol number, but your age, your blood pressure, and I think weight, and even if you have type 2 diabetes, and they come out with a number. So when they moved from single cholesterol number to a percentage risk, US decided that if you had a risk of 7.5% of developing heart disease in the next 10 years, you would be prescribed a statin. And that's compared to a higher threshold in the UK of 20%. So by simply changing from a single cholesterol number to this very low percentage risk profile, it increased the number of Americans being prescribed statins by 12.8 million. But what was most concerning is that the majority of these people were actually elderly people without established heart disease, and this is the population that would get virtually no benefit from these medications. Then there was concern about these calculators, that they were perhaps overestimating the risk of the patients. And one study showed that 4 out of 5 of these calculators were actually overestimating the risk, some up to 115%. So that started really driving this overdiagnosis and overtreatment and overprescription of statin medications. And it was referred to as the statinization of the population by Professor John Ioannidis, a professor at Stanford University. So industry bias has become a big issue. In the 1980s, when former President Ronald Reagan was in power, he significantly slashed public funding to the National Institutes of Health. And this left a gaping hole for private industry to come in and start sponsoring their own clinical trials. And this is essentially what happened with the statin trials. The vast majority of statin trials are funded by manufacturers. So when you have drug companies sponsoring their own trials and publishing their own peer-reviewed results, Cochrane has established well and truly that this favours the benefits of the drug and underestimates the risks. And this is what has led the founder of the Nordic Cochrane collaboration, Professor Peter Goetscher, to say that when the drug industry sponsors trials and cannot be examined or questioned by independent researchers, that science ceases to exist and it becomes nothing more than marketing. Now, the very nature of science is its contestability. We need to be able to challenge and re-challenge scientific results to ensure that they're reproducible and they're legitimate. But there's been a cloud of secrecy around the clinical trials on statins. Most people are not aware that the raw data on statin side effects have never been released to the public. It is controlled by one group of researchers led by Professor Rory Collins under the CTT collaboration, which is under the CTSU at Oxford University. So they hold all the raw data on the statin side effects. Now, this is an incredibly influential group of scientists. They periodically publish meta-analyses that advocate the wider use of statins. This is the group that were promoting that everybody over the age of 50, even if they had normal cholesterol, should be on statin medications. Now, they claim to be an independent organisation, but we know from internal documents that were revealed to the British Medical Journal that CTSU has received over £260 million from the makers of cholesterol-lowering medications. Now, the reason they obtain this data is because they've signed a legally binding agreement with the principal investigators of the clinical trials, which are the drug companies, And they've agreed to withhold the raw data from any third party, and they will not permit independent researchers to verify these results. So this is an egregious lack of transparency in science. Sharing data with other researchers is vital for scientific transparency because it allows for independent scientists to scrutinise the clinical trial results, and then it fosters a greater confidence about the true benefits and risks of a medication. Now, this is not just for the public who are taking these medications. This is for the doctors who want to relay balanced information to their patients when they prescribe these medications. They want to tell patients about the harms and the benefits of these medications so that patients are able to make informed choices about which pills they want to take. So it's not surprising that all of this secrecy around the side effects of statins has raised concerns about the authenticity of the statin data. Now, this situation, we need to learn from situations in the past, and Tamiflu is a prime example of a medication where governments around the world spent millions and millions of dollars stockpiling this medication in the event of a flu pandemic, based on information that we got from the drug companies, that it shortened the span of having the flu and that it reduced hospital complications. But a tenacious group of Cochrane researchers lobbied hard to get access to the clinical trial reports that the drug companies had never revealed to the public. And it took several years, but in essentially a public shaming campaign in collaboration with the British Medical Journal, the drug companies finally handed over that data, and the Cochrane researchers did do an independent review, and they found that Tamiflu was not as effective as it was made out to be, that it had much more side effects, and it didn't reduce hospital complications. So this was a very revealing lesson when we learnt that Tamiflu was probably no better than taking ordinary, cheap paracetamol when you get the flu. Another way that you can influence public opinion and doctors' opinions about the efficacy of statin medications is to design a trial to minimise the harms. And this is essentially what happened in the heart protection study. They design a trial with what they call a run-in period. So they gather, say, thousands of participants, and they put all the participants on the drug for a period of 4 to 6 weeks. Then at the end of this run-in period, there's a high dropout rate. People stop taking the medication, they don't tolerate it, mostly due to side effects. In the heart protection study, 36% of the participants dropped out in this first phase of the trial. So with this freshly culled population of participants, that's when they begin the clinical trial, and they separate them between placebo and statins. So at the end, the side effect rates between the statin group and the placebo group are fairly similar. So we know that cutting out all of those people that had side effects from the medication before the trial began grossly underestimates the percentage of people that will experience side effects at the end of the trial. And this is probably why we see that the side effect rate in the statin trials is wildly different to the rates that we see in real-world populations. So when you ask doctors what the complication and side effect rates are of statins, they usually say around 20 to 30% of their patients feel muscle pain and brain fog. Another way that a drug company can market the medication and exaggerate the benefits is to exaggerate the statistics. Now, most of you have heard doctors and public health authorities say that statins reduce your risk of developing heart disease by over 30%. Now, in Australia, direct-to-consumer advertising is illegal, but it's not illegal to advertise direct to doctors. And this is the kind of advertisement that you'll see in a doctor magazine. This is an Australian doctor publication. It says, Lipitor reduces the risk of heart attack by 36%. and they have a picture of an eminent and trustworthy doctor, and why wouldn't you relay that to your patients? I'd be impressed with a medication that would reduce my risk by 36%. But when you look closer at the study, this is the study it came from 2008. It was published in the European Heart Journal, and again, Rory Collins appears on this publication. And on table 4, it actually shows that if you take placebo, your risk of having a heart attack is about 3.1%. So this is taking the sugar pill. However, if you take the statin, your risk drops to 2%. So from 3.1% down to 2% is about a 36% reduction, but the absolute risk reduction was only 1.1%. And that sounds much less impressive, especially to a patient when they're talking to their doctor about whether they want to take statins. Now, the reason this is really important for patients is because they have the fear of God put in them that you're going to die if you stop taking your statins. But these kind of statistics will just help the patient make more informed choices about whether or not they want to take a medication, because if they're suffering really badly from side effects, they have severe muscle pain and they can't exercise, they have brain fog, they have memory lapses, they can't function properly at work, then maybe some of them are willing to take the risk of this absolute reduction of 1.1%. So it's important to give patients honest and transparent information. One of the ways in which drug companies can effectively influence public opinion, and it's a powerful way, is to silence dissenters. One of the ways to do this is scientific publications. In 2016, there was a 30-page review authored by Professor Rory Collins, again, in a very high-profile journal called The Lancet. It claimed to end the statin debate once and for all. Statins were safe and not to listen to any media hype because these medications are wonderful, even for people at low risk of heart disease. So this received widespread media attention, and most of the news coverage in the UK, the US, and Australia even widely publicised this view. Another way to silence dissenters is to discredit them. Now, Professor Rory Collins in a UK outlet said that those who question statin side effects are far worse and have probably killed more people than the paper on the MMR vaccine. So again, accusing you of murdering people is an effective way at trying to discredit you. Professor Steve Nissen from the Cleveland Clinic also said that we need to push back on people challenging statins. And he said that there was a rise in the internet cult. So calling you a cult leader or a cult follower is an effective way to discredit you. And lastly, one of the most effective ways to silence dissenting views is about censorship. And we've heard a lot about Gary Fettke, which many of you would know, so I won't go into much of that now. But I'll just talk really briefly about my experience at ABC Catalyst program. So in 2013, I did a 2-part series called Heart of the Matter. Just a show of hands, who's familiar with this controversy that happened? Okay, so a lot of you. I feel like I'm preaching to the converted. So really briefly, it was a 2-part series. The first challenged the long-held belief that saturated fat caused heart disease by raising cholesterol. And the second part of the series, which was the one that caused all the controversy, was called Cholesterol Drug Wars, and we questioned the overprescription of statins and the overwhelming industry influence in statin trials. They went to air, they received an extraordinary amount of attention. They rated 1.5 million, which was profound ratings at that time slot. And we were receiving thousands of congratulatory letters and texts and on social media from people that were really happy with us. And of course, and more importantly, the managing director and director of television at the ABC were really pleased about the outcome of these trials, these programs, until we started receiving complaints from Heart Foundation, who were criticised in this program, very scathing complaints, and from, of course, the drug companies and a few vested interest groups. So this is when the orchestrated campaign to discredit myself and the programs began. We had ABC's health commentator, Norman Swan, go on national radio and say people will die if they watch this program. We had a Sydney cardiologist at Royal Prince Alfred, David Sellermeyer, go to the Sydney Morning Herald and say ABC has blood on its hands. Cardiologist Dr. Peter Clifton, he was a paid sponsor on Meadow-Lee margarine and has received money from the sugar industry, Coca-Cola. In the Medical Observer, he encouraged people to contact Slatter and Gordon and sue the ABC if anybody had watched the program and gone off their statins and had a heart attack. And of course, a scathing review by the National Heart Foundation CEO. She wrote an editorial in the Sydney Morning Herald saying that the program and the messages were dangerous. And this was a really difficult tide to stop, or at least counter, because our entire Catalyst team were put under a gag order. We were not allowed to defend ourselves in the media. So this criticism kind of avalanched, and it took on a life of its own. And then, of course, very widespread media attention on an article that was published by Professor Emily Banks in the Medical Journal of Australia, saying that the Catalyst program caused thousands of people to stop taking their medication, and they predicted that this would cause up to 2,900 potentially fatal heart attacks and strokes. So that was kind of the final nail in the coffin for the programs. We were accused of mass murder. Unfortunately, ABC capitulated to the pressure and the increased scrutiny, and they decided to remove the programs from the website. So overall, it was a real disservice to the public discourse on statins. We wanted people to go to their doctor and question their medications and become more educated about their medications. But we were being bombarded by doctors saying, how dare these patients come into my clinic and question me about prescribing them statin medications? And I was like, well, that was exactly the point of the programs. Why are you so upset? I'll just mention briefly this campaign, scare campaign that happened in France, because it was very similar to what happened to me, but it had a slightly different outcome. So again, widespread media attention when a French cardiologist questioned the value of statins in a new book, and this received a lot of attention in the French press. Same sort of thing again, a report came out blaming the book and the media hype for causing a 50% increase in statin discontinuation, so lots of people going off their statins. And they started making predictions and extrapolations that this would cause 10,000 deaths. So extraordinary amount of people were expected to die in the following year because of this media hype. But this time, researchers actually went back to the national statistics as opposed to just sort of calculating a predicted number of deaths that would happen in the future. And the national statistics showed that the number of deaths decreased in the year following all of this media hype. And so it led the authors to conclude that it was not evidence-based to claim that statin discontinuation increases mortality, and that in future, scientists should assess the real or actual effects of statin discontinuation rather than making dubious extrapolations and calculations. So that's where I'll end. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and hope you enjoyed it.